Of all the stuff we cover and do on this channel, nothing gets more views or positive feedback than when we do the history stuff. You guys eat it up. You know, and it's not just like, you know, old timers that are reminiscing. A lot of you young guys, you know, 16, 17, 18 years old, you know, you're getting eaten up with the car thing, and it's like you want to know where it all came from. And there was a golden age, there was a golden era between, let's call it a 10-year period between 1964 and 1974. And pre-1974 is like the prehistoric stuff. You've got the genesis of the things that came along, you know, the big blocks and all of that, but it was still archaic. And then you get post 1974, and really the party was over. There was doom, there was the gas crisis, there was downsizing of everything, there was the manufacturers were just like running away and hiding from performance. The things like drag racing had become too commercialized. The Winston money went in there, and it became like the sport of kings versus the sport of the people, you know. There was a magical 10-year period where everything was great. No, not everything. There's a lot of screwed up things going on in the world, kind of like today. But as far as the car thing goes, it was the golden age. And pretty much everything you know today has its roots in that era. You know, things that, I mean, imports, mini cars, turbochargers, nitrous oxide, even like the outlaw stuff, you know, the grudge racing, the street outlaws, no prep kings and all of that. It all has direct roots to the match race madness days of 1964, 65, 66. Everything you have today has its roots in that 1964 to 1974 period. Because the internet and YouTube is relatively new, let's say over the last 20 years, relatively new, 20, 25 years, a lot of that has been like lost. Like you can find the highlights, you can find like the big, you know, milestone events online, you can find videos of them and so on and so forth. But a lot of the cars, the people, the events are kind of lost. You don't find them, there's no magazine industry anymore. And like I said, because the internet is relatively new, those older stories, those historical events, people, they haven't, you know, been all cataloged through the internet. It's kind of like a void, right? So the magazines played a huge role. Kind of like, you know, like YouTube today. You know, if you're into cars, you know, you go to YouTube and you search and you find, you know, the thing about your car, or the thing about, you know, the thing that you're working on, or the tutorials or whatever. In that golden age, 64 to 74, the only thing we had collectively as a car community was the magazine, and they were everywhere. You know, if you went to a newsstand, a candy store, they used to have candy stores, and they'd have magazine racks, and that's like where kids like me would go out and buy these things. 8, 9, 10 years old, and I was doing anything I could, washing cars, mowing lawns, cleaning pools, whatever I could do, walking dogs, anything I could do to make 50 cents to go buy the next magazine. And there would be a new one out every Tuesday, I think it was, for the place I used to hit. They'd have a whole new shipment of magazines come in. And then the next day at school, it was like I would do anything I could to get in trouble, to get like in time out, especially like gym class. I'd start a fight with somebody, so they made me go sit on the side in the bleachers, and then I could sit and read my new magazine. I taught myself how to read out of these things, because when I was like a young kid, I was like 6, 7 years old, I needed to know what it said under the picture, so I figured out how to read. These things, for anybody my age, these magazines, they were like an invaluable part of the experience. And if these things framed our outlook on cars, on life, I mean, this was really profound stuff. You can't really grasp it if you're part of the newer generation. But you can get these old magazines. So let's say you're curious, you want to know about the 60s, the 70s, you want to know the roots of the engines and the technologies and the sport and everything that you're into today, and you want to see, you know, trace it back to, you know, those golden ages, the genesis of it all. You can still find these things cheap. Like what they're worth in terms of information, education, it's priceless. But you can still find them at swap meets and garage sales and estate sales online for $2 a copy, $3 a copy. If you really want to know where it all came from. You want to know the facts about what car did what. You know, this is where you find it. So what I wanted to do is I put together a stack of the popular titles, like the ones that I used to go for when I was a kid. There were so many of them. And obviously things like Road and Track and Car and Drive, it didn't really cater to the hot rodder, you know. So I leave those out. But what I did was I put together a stack of all of the popular titles, like I said, the ones that I would seek after and like literally absorb, you know, devour cover to cover. I mean, I memorized the ads that were in these things. So what I wanted to do is give a quick review of each of the main titles, major titles, so that if you are interested in pursuing, you know, you get an idea of what you're buying, you know, what you're looking for. And if you could build yourself a library of this stuff, man, I'm telling you, it's great for the head. So, all right, I've got them basically in order of importance, right, for the era and, like, you know, for me. So obviously hot rod, right? You know, the underline was Everybody's Automotive Magazine, and it was Everybody's Automotive Magazine. You could find anything in here. The beauty of Hot Rod Magazine from that era is that they covered drag racing, muscle cars, the current muscle cars of the era, NASCAR, IndyCar, well, before it was IndyCar, so Indy 500, right? Sprint cars, boats, like you name it. Like if it had a hot rod-ish aspect to it, you'd find it in Hot Rod. The technical stories were phenomenal. They were all written by guys who were hands-on. They really knew their stuff. Like nobody was poking around in the dark. It was a first-class operation every step of the way. And these, believe it or not, these are like the cheapest of the ones that you'll find, because there were so many of them. I mean, Hot Rod was distributed in way over 1 million copies around 1970. So they're still around. You can still find them in good shape. By the way, none of my magazines are pristine. These things are like my cars. You know, I don't treat them like special things. To me, it's a magazine, and I throw them around. I don't keep them in covers or cataloged or anything like that. You know, in my mind, it's still 1972. So, Hot Rod, if you're seeking good, well-rounded information from that era, Hot Rod's your good first choice. Carcraft, during that period of time, the bang on this was Drag Racing's Complete Magazine, and it was. And for my money, this was the best written, probably magazine of all time. The staff, beginning with the Terry Cook years, like 1968, 1967, 1968, right on through the end of like 73, 74, when I went off into Vanland. The articles, the stories that are in these magazines are fantastic, and they cover every aspect of drag racing. You'll find, you know, obviously the glory cars, the nitro cars, and pro stock cars. Is Jenkins Vega. That's the car that completely revolutionized pro stock. Maybe not for the better, but I mean, it's history, right? Information for your tow car, you name it, every aspect of it. And like I said, the writing was like bang on. It was great stuff. When I went into magazines later on in the 1980s, this magazine was like my inspiration for all of the stuff and the ideas that I would have and the directions I would kind of push things into. It was Carcraft from this era. Like great reading, even today. A lot of funny stuff in those magazines too. So popular hot rodding. You know, for 45 years now, I've been trying to figure out why this was always my least favorite. I only bought popular hot rodding after all of the other magazines that I would normally buy were like either sold out or didn't have any copies of them. The only thing left was popular hot rodding. I'm like, if I have a choice between like Motor Trend or popular hot rodding, I'll grab popular hot rodding. It wasn't a bad magazine. They covered all of the stuff that Carcraft covered. It was just a little bit lighter, you know, it was a little fluffier. But there were, looking back at these magazines now, there were good how-tos. I guess maybe when I was younger, for my sensibilities, I was more interested in the high-impact end of things. And popular hot rodding was a little bit more basic. You know, if you want to know how to do a good home valve job or stuff like that, this is where you'd find it. But this was number 3 of the big 3. So, you know, I wasn't crazy about them, but there is a lot of good stuff in these magazines, and you can still find them. There's a bunch of them out there. Let's cars, high-performance cars. So this was the East Coast answer to the West Coast magazines, the Hot Rod and the Carcraft. In those days, all of the trends, the big trends, started in California and worked their way across the country and ended up, on the East Coast. So these magazines were a little bit behind the time, a little bit behind, what Hot Rod or Carcraft would be. And it were a little bit of a copycat, a little bit of a catch-up type of thing. But they had great overall tech articles, cars that you would never see in any of the other magazines because they were, East Coast cars. A lot of obscure stuff. It makes a good, interesting reading. It's a nice counterbalance to the West Coast magazine. So if you're building a collection, you want high performance cars, and this actually is the ancestor of Cars Illustrated, which is one of the magazines that I did. So if you're gonna count, the big three, right? Hot Rod, Carcraft, Popular Hot Rodding, this would be number 4, and it kind of like fits in there, and it well rounds the overall, let's say, national picture of the day. When I was a kid, my favorite was Drag Racing USA, because I was just totally eat up with funny cars and dragsters and anything with nitro, anything that was, over the top. And Drag Racing USA that's what it was all about. They did some stuff on door slammers, some stuff on the lower class cars, but their focus was like, funny cars, right? Dragsters. It was like the stuff that, it was loaded with pictures, lots of good art, lots of good car features. Much lighter than the other magazines in terms of tech or let's say road tests, that sort of thing. But if you're into drag racing, pre-corporate sanitized drag racing, Drag Racing USA is definitely the magazine. Like I said, when I got to the newsstand, I saw a new copy of Drag Racing USA. I was like, right? I was like all over it. So you definitely want to look into these things. Superstock and Drag Illustrated. Like Drag Racing USA, only drag racing stuff. Well, I shouldn't say only drag racing stuff. They did road tests, they did whatnot, but it was all based on drag racing. Superstock was as good as, let's say, Carcraft in the day. It just didn't have the same circulation, and because it was an East Coast magazine, it didn't have quite the same, it didn't have the hitter high-end stuff like you'd find in Carcraft, but it was still an excellent magazine. If you're modifying a 60s car, 70s car for drag racing, straight line performance, there's a lot of excellent information you can find in Superstock and Drag Illustrated. And actually, I ended up my writing career, at the end of my writing days, that's the magazine I wrote for. You had a lot of knockoff magazines. They all pretty much came from the East Coast. This was one of them, Speed and Supercar. But there were so many of them. There was like Rodder and Factory Experimental and Funny Car and Superstock, and like they just threw all of these different combinations of names together. And they were all done by like this little consortium of East Coast guys that like worked out of little offices and just they just assembly line these things off as fast as they could. There's a lot of obscure stuff in there. Nothing of it, you'll never really find anything of great value in these magazines, but they can be a fun read. And like I said, you get to see a lot of the more obscure, East Coast and Midwest cars. You'll find less Top Fuel and Funny Car and more modified Eliminator and like gasser sort of stuff in these magazines. And then the last of the ones that I would go for when I was a kid was kind of like way out of my, realm, but Car Life. Okay, so now Car Life, if you guys are into stock cars, like, let's say you're restoring a car, or you're into the way the things were built originally and their performance and how they stacked up to other cars, Car Life is like a Bible. This was like the best magazine for regular cars, production cars that I think there ever was. Every road test that they did, every comparison that they did, it's loaded with facts. Every specification, every weight, every dimension, how many gallons of gas it held, and I mean, right on down the line. All the information. If you're doing a 60s car, or if you're into 60s and 70s cars, Car Life is like, it's like a Bible. if you find these things, they're gold. They're very hard to come by. It was a limited production, you know, not a limited production. There wasn't a big print magazine, so there weren't a lot of them out there, and they're a little bit harder to find today. But definitely, absolutely worth it if you're hunting magazines. Those are the big ones. There are lots of, like, they did a lot of specials, you know, only funny cars, only, you know, pictorials, only, there was so much material flowing in like the 1960s and the early 1970s that, like I said, if you're into the stuff, the history of it all, starting a collection and really getting absorbed and wrapped up into these old magazines is like, it's just a trip, you know. Even the ads were great in these things. You know, definitely less politically correct than you know, you find today. So if you guys are, you know, if you find this stuff interesting, you know, let me know in the comments, because what I could do is I could run through some of these books every once a week or so. I can run through some of these books and find some features that, you know, maybe more obscure stuff, things you won't find anyplace else on the internet, and you know, we could talk about, you know, show you what was going on in those things. So let me know how you feel about that. And that said, I guess I gotta get back to getting dirty because I have cars to build and finish. So I see you guys tomorrow.